Ever since I watched Cid's fight against Iris as Mundane Man in the Bushin Festival, I always thought that it was a bit odd that he treated her so differently than some of his other opponents during that arc. He seemed much more antagonistic with his approach towards her. He caused her to hallucinate, dying on multiple occasions with his feints, and ultimately leaves her motionless and terrified. At first, I thought that he was just using this as his big reveal where he shows that he's actually strong, but if that were the case, why do it this way? I mean, the audience can't even really tell what's going on. They just see him not even moving. He's really only displaying his power to Iris and forcing her to realize the massive difference in their strengths. Besides, he didn't even really show his true self until he saw Rose kill her father and decided in that moment that he could capitalize on the confusion and make things even more dramatic. Later on, while he's fighting Beatrix and Iris simultaneously, he is always much more brutal against Iris. Now, that could just boil down to Beatrix being a better fighter and therefore able to trade blows with Shadow more easily, but I also think that Shadow is just genuinely treating Iris differently in that fight. So I started to wonder, maybe Cid went through all of that with Iris because he just genuinely doesn't like her. But then I had to ask, why? If he really doesn't like her, why? I mean, they've barely even spoken to each other, and he never really seemed to show any distaste towards really anyone up to that point in the series, only ever quickly dispatching opponents he didn't care for and giving props to those he enjoyed fighting. Cid doesn't really show much interest in anyone in particular throughout the series, and instead shows more interest in situations, especially those that he can capitalize on to make himself seem even more badass or Eminence and shadowy. But in the situation he found himself in, fighting Iris as Mundane Man and later as Shadow, there were so many other ways he could have chosen to make himself look just as cool, if not even cooler. Ways that didn't necessarily involve embarrassing Iris as much as he did, and ultimately push her to despise him even more than she already did. It almost feels like he not only wanted to look cool in this scenario, but also humble Iris. Potentially because he believes she doesn't deserve all of the praise she receives. Honestly, I think the reason that Cid might actually have some distaste towards Iris really boils down to how he views battle and his standards of excellence in that field. As we heard him explain during his fight with Aurora during the Goddess trial, Cid views fighting as a conversation. Dodging, blocking, parrying, and even feints are all things that he considers vocabulary. This is partially how he's capable of going into fights and performing as well as he does. It's almost as if fighting to him is an art form, something to be highly regarded, studied, and mastered. It isn't simply a means to an end, something that he has to do in order to achieve goals. Fighting means so much more to him. It's quite possibly something he enjoys even more than pretending to be the edgiest dude in the universe. And so with this much respect put on fighting, Cid obviously would dislike those that he thinks aren't properly respecting this activity. He mostly dislikes when people solely rely on instinct in fights, as he sees that as them ignoring the conversation and ignoring their opponent in some ways. He sees this as not necessarily disrespect though, but as a primitive way of fighting, and possibly even somebody not putting in the effort to actually try to understand. See, surprisingly enough, Cid doesn't really respect power, as we've seen him disrespect many people that have it. What he's shown to mostly respect is actually effort. We see this when he gives props to Epsilon for her magic control, even though she is usually using it in ways that he deems unnecessary. He also gives credit to Delta, somebody that does mostly rely on instinct in fights, but also somebody that has put in a lot of effort, and somebody he considers to be the best in Shadow Garden at condensing her magic to make it as strong as possible. However, his most meaningful moment of respecting someone's effort is with Alexia Midgar, Iris' sister. While pretend dating her, Cid duels her in class and learns a lot about her sword style. He learns people call her the swordsman ordinaire, as a way to mock her underwhelming abilities compared to her sisters. However, unlike those that mocked her, Cid actually says that he likes her swordplay, something he says because he can tell that there was a lot of effort put into it and he sees great potential in it as well. Alexia says that he isn't the only one to have said that to her though. In fact, Iris said that she liked it as well, but Alexia says that she hates it. She believes, like everyone else, that she'll never be as strong as her sister, that her swordplay will always be ordinary and unable to be anything more. Now, I might be looking too far into this, but I think that this scene might be the first time that Cid actually starts to show some resentment towards Iris. I mean, he says himself that he doesn't really like it when people hate the things that he likes. And although Iris seemed to share in his enjoyment of Alexia's swordsmanship, she also is the reason that Alexia is unable to share in that enjoyment. It's because of Iris that Alexia is mocked and teased about her inability to be as talented as her sister. This teasing and mocking actually end up stunting her growth as a swordsman and make her feel like her efforts are wasted. It isn't until Shadow shows her the true potential of her swordplay that she starts to feel motivated again. So in Cid's eyes, Alexia's efforts are being mocked because of Iris, something that he despises. Now, during Iris's fight against Mundane Man, we notice that she's unable to properly respond to his feints, which could imply that her ability to speak during this fight is greatly inferior to Cid's. In fact, it might even be a sign that she's unable to speak during battle and that she's a good example of somebody that solely relies on instinct, something that I mentioned earlier that Cid dislikes. Add that to his not-so-great first impression of Iris when learning about her from Alexia, and you could see why he might not necessarily like her. But does he hate her? I would say not really, at least not yet. You see, his feints during that fight were likely just him attempting to converse with somebody that he thought was capable of it. I mean, everything he's heard about Iris up to this point in the story has been incredible praise. She was considered to be one of the strongest Dark Knights, not just in the kingdom, but in the world itself, and the easy favorite to win the Bushin Festival. She was hyped to an incredible degree, so it kind of makes sense that his expectations would be high as well. However, his expectations were not met, and he was perhaps disappointed in her abilities. He also perhaps wished to expose her at that time for not being as strong as many thought, that she was a bit of a fraud in his eyes. She is somebody that has a lot of power though, but none of it is used in the right ways. He likely doesn't see the same effort as he saw in Alexia because things likely just came quicker to her. She didn't need to put in as much effort in order to get better results. In his fight with Beatrix, Cid mentions that her magic is clumsy and could be stronger if it were more refined, and yet from what we see of Iris, her magic seems even more chaotic than Beatrix's. That unrefined nature is potentially another sign that Iris hasn't really put in the effort to necessarily become strong. She's only strong because of her natural talent, something that Cid doesn't respect nearly as much as somebody who actually uses their talents to reach their highest potential. Cid and Iris are also almost natural enemies because they differ in so many different ways. Cid enjoys his freedom to dick around and do whatever he wants with little thought on what the morally correct thing to do is, whereas Iris desires complete control and feels powerless when she doesn't have control over a situation. Cid is a perfect example of somebody who has reached his complete potential and still continues to grow and learn from his many experiences by observing and attempting various things, whereas Iris is an example of wasted potential. Somebody who is only considered strong because of her natural talent, and she has likely spent much less effort on observing and attempting new things since her current methods have always worked out in the past. Now, there is one more scene I want to talk about in regard to why Cid might actually dislike Iris as well, and it's during his fight with Beatrix. While fighting Beatrix, Iris gets so frustrated and angered at Shadow that she decides to grab the artifact sword and join in on the fight. Now, she does calmly ask to partake in the fight, but it's easy to tell why she wants to fight Shadow, and it's due to her hatred towards him because she feels like him and Shadow Garden are destroying her country. While joining the fight, she does mention her sword artifact and says that she hopes Shadow doesn't mind since she's only using it because of how strong he is, implying that her using it is actually a compliment towards his abilities. However, Shadow responds to that with saying that it doesn't matter because no one can beat him with borrowed strength, implying that he sees people using artifacts as lesser fighters and is blatantly disrespecting Iris in this moment. He also might be equating Iris's use of this artifact to the use of the pills by the cult members that he's fought in the past, since those are also borrowed strength, which in that case is even more disrespectful since he's never really showing much acknowledgement of the cult members' abilities, not to mention that they are likely a group of people that Iris would likely despise being compared to. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that Iris hates Shadow, and if she knew that Sid was the same person, she would easily hate him too. But do I genuinely think that Sid hates Iris? I don't really know. Honestly, this video is mostly speculative and meant to just point out some observations I've had about the few interactions that these characters have throughout the series so far. I will say though that I do believe Sid does not respect her, and he thinks very little of her abilities and strengths. I'll also say that it was a bit odd that he went to such lengths to seemingly expose her as a fraud in front of all of those people during the Bushin Festival. However, I'm honestly just not sure if Sid can even harbor hatred towards anybody, as we've seen him throughout the series handle every situation with a completely calm mind and very little, if any, emotion behind what he does. But let me know what you think. Do you think Sid genuinely hates Iris, or do you think I'm crazy and looking way too deep into something that isn't actually there? Let me know. Before I go though, I do want to thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Peace.